Okay, so this is my PSA pitch, and yeah, let's just get right into it. So I focused on industrial agriculture with a holistic, ethical approach. So this is kind of the quote that inspired my whole project, so I'll share it with everyone. There are two spiritual dangers of not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other is that heat comes from the furnace. Okay, so what exactly is industrial agriculture? Well, basically there are a bunch of federal policies that subsidize big corporate land use for agriculture so that prices stay low and products stays high. This was originally started in the 40s to make sure that we didn't have, another type of Great Depression instance where food was short, and then the war feeding everyone, and then grocery stores arrived in the 50s, and that whole consumer power, they really wanted that, and so that's what the government gave. However, in this picture, as you can see, is the Corn Belt, which we'll talk about soon. This whole paper kind of focuses on corn specifically, even though that a lot of federal agricultural policies can also touch on cattle as well. However, these big subsidies used to be given directly to farmers and sometimes still are. However, it really promotes big corporate power in the sense that they can maximize profit through their tools and technologies, and so this often leaves small farmers helpless. This can also lead to monoculture farms, which is specifically in the Corn Belt where all they really produce is corn, so you don't see a lot of variety or regenerative soil and stuff like that. So it can lead to a lot of environmental problems, which we're going to talk about right now. So yeah, just as I was saying, soil depletion is a big one. So the soil actually holds a lot of life within it, like worms and fungi and mold and all that stuff, and algae too. But when you just till the soil, you're kind of destroying that entire ecosystem, just like clear cutting a forest. And yes, like natural processes do already decay or deplete the soil, but with intensive tilling and turning of the soil through industrialized agriculture, it really intensifies this depletion. Another thing is then they compact the soil to help produce a higher yield, and that levels out all oxygen that can be given to those living organisms, so the soil actually dies. Anyway, that also happens to be why fertilizers are so heavily used with soil through industrialized agriculture. Because the soil is dying, they need that high yield. They're constantly putting these chemicals in, which are filled with a lot of nitrogen and phosphates. This is a ton of nutrients, and it actually depletes the soil because it alters its natural chemical state. Likewise, the runoff from these fertilizers actually creates an ecological problem in and of itself. So as you can see here, this is an hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is commonly known, it's been recorded by the EPA, from all this excessive nutrients running off through the rivers and into the ocean. It creates or depletes the oxygen in there. As algae, feed off of the nutrients, then they decay, there's blocking of sunlight, and then the oxygen can't replenish itself. So fish and other aquatic life just disappear. So it's really sad, and a lot of ecosystems are impacted through just the use of fertilizer, which is really increased industrialized agriculture. Likewise, I didn't even touch about this in my paper because it was too long, but water usage in general in America for our way of agriculture is just very poorly managed. So not only is our water being contaminated with excessive nutrients, but it is also being used in just unsustainable ways. Lastly, less yield over time. That is basically, as the soil depletes, you're not going to get bigger and better crops. It's just, in the long run, it's not going to be that efficient. Okay, now moving on to human impacts. This is interesting because there's a lot of different avenues that it can touch, and the one is just our diet. So there's sweet corn and field corn, and a lot of farmers talk about the difference. Specifically in that Corn Belt that I mentioned earlier, Iowa, less than 1% is actually sweet corn, which is that good omega-3 fatty acid that we just consume right off the cob, and it's awesome for us. They actually majority produce field corn, which has a lot of omega-6. And it's not that omega-6 fatty acids are bad. Both of these type of fatty acids help rebuild our cell membranes and keep us healthy. However, omega-3s have a ton more benefits, such as heart protection and blood pressure and diabetes, and also preventing from certain types of cancers, which is huge. So that lack of omega-3 can have some negative effects on us. Also, the corn that we actually, get from the yield and use, we're not eating, like I said. We actually turn it into livestock, livestock feed, which goes to our livestock, and then we're eating the corn that is not really good for us, that's just shoved into an animal. So it's not good in that way, but we're not even talking about animals. It also produces energy, which is a whole other separate category. The last thing I want to talk about, though, is that the field corn is then produced and made into high fructose corn syrup, which that is just a very, very bad thing to intake. It's not good for our diet. It really depletes our nutrients, and it actually leads to obesity, which is a very, very negative health impact. So yeah, let's carry on. So another impact that kind of ties the environment and humanity together is climate change. So we all know temperatures are rising because of the excessive CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases that are perpetuating climate change. And these effects are going to be in multitudes, but the biggest one we're going to focus on is just storms. And these changes are predicted to lead to an increased intensity of the storms and frequency of the storms. So not only will they be happening harder and faster, but more frequently. And, if the soil, someone could argue if the soil wasn't as depleted through this industrialized agriculture, it could handle it. But since we're constantly farming this way in an unsustainable manner, there's less nutrients there. It's been through so much wear and tear that it's just going to erode faster. And that is going to lead to not only land shifts, but flooding. And that flooding will not only impact the environment and different ecosystems, but it will also impact homes and people like us who might be displaced if we're, in the center of the country where farms are typically located, and we might find ourselves shifting elsewhere. So it has a lot of wild impacts. So coming back to this, we're going to get into the ethical approach of this argument, and I'm going to be focusing on a holistic approach, which is what Aldo Leopold, the first quote that I mentioned, famously argues for. So a holistic approach in general is basically claiming that the community doesn't get value because of the individual, but the individual gets value because of the community. So it's kind of radical in that sense, that it prioritizes the ecosystem as a whole, or the community as a whole, rather than the individual, which is a very American Western ideal. However, this isn't to say that the individual isn't important, as we will soon discuss. But jumping into a few points that I really take away from Aldo Leopold's argument is, one, the means of production. So this is basically saying that the more technology and the more affluent society becomes, there's going to be less of the consumer at the source. So, there's going to be cooler ways to just get the product right to us, and then we don't have to deal with it. We don't have to do it ourselves or see how it's made, because we just have it. And that really resonated with me, because I see in my own generation and my siblings' generation that no one really thinks about how farms are, how things are produced on farms, or where farms are even at, or the problems on farms, the problems within the soil, as we mentioned. No one thinks about it, because we just run to the grocery store, or we run through a drive-thru, and the food's right there, and it tastes great, looks great, it's great. But that's kind of the big problem that Leopold points out, is if we're not at the source, if our hands aren't in the soil, and we're not working with the food, we get an opportunity to forget, or to push aside the potential problems that could arise. And that's dangerous, because there's a ton of risk involved with farming that society is just now overlooking. Okay, third cut, but we're just working with it. So, moving on to this next point, less community. So, back in the day, families would really consider the ingredients that they're putting into their meals, take the time to prepare a meal, share it among their family and friends or community members, and it was just like kind of a sacred time and just a ritual, a way of life that was not really questioned until more so the individual choice came into play with this industrialized agriculture. It's just one part of a system that upholds this. And what I mean by that is I can just go now, run through a drive-thru and just pick up something that I like, or go to the grocery store, see something prepackaged that just suits my needs, and it's right there on my time, on my watch, on my taste buds. And that's not to discredit anyone's personal preferences or accommodations that they may need, not at all, but it's just to say that now that that individual choice is so predominantly used and upheld, that it lessens the value of a community or a shared meal, which I think has a lot of value just in and of itself. And the last thing I'll briefly mention is justice, and I go into this a little more in my paper, but basically just communities that already are dealing with food insecurities, and then there's communities that have a surplus, and it's just ridiculous. And there's so many inequalities that industrial agriculture exacerbates, and if it's not addressed, it will never get better. And you hate to see that, because as a holistic approach, one part of the community isn't less valuable than another, but like we're all in this together type of thing. So yeah, just trying to get some environmental justice in there too. Okay, so moving on to one of the last parts, solutions. I think that it's appropriate to first address the individual and what they can do, because a lot of times with holistic approaches, some people can say, oh, it's eco-fascist because they're discrediting the individual, but not at all. Like, we still have power in a sense that I would argue that if you can, you should. And so if you can afford to buy, a product that was made locally or ethically or regenerates their land or has a special practice that they promote, you should buy it, even if it costs maybe $5 more. You can afford that. Also, vote with your money. I'm a big advocate for, putting your money where your mouth is and spending your dollar as if you are promoting that company or that brand or that food. However, you can also support local markets and all that stuff that I listed. However, consumer isn't really king anymore, and I would argue this because industrial agriculture originated from federal policy that systematically put these ways into our culture and our norms. So even though the individual choice is awesome and I'm advocating for that, it's not going to change the entire problem in and of itself, because the entire problem is systematic and is through policy. So that leads to my collective action solution, which is so needed. We need people to come together and band for good policy and reform and stuff that will actually change the structure of our agricultural ways. So one way you can do this is read up on some local issues, see what vegetables and products are grown near you or what your local interest groups are fighting for, and get connected with them. Also vote for candidates that have plans about agriculture specifically. Oftentimes now in modern days we forget that things aren't just in the city. Like, we still need our rural members, so remember to keep that in mind. And the last thing is share this information. If you think it sounds good, if you're persuaded by me, definitely share this with your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, so that they too can maybe jump on this movement with us and we can change industrial agriculture to a more holistic and sustainable approach. Thanks.